From our 22 News Broadcast Center, this is 22 News in Focus.
A good Sunday afternoon and welcome to 22 News in Focus. I'm Juliana Mazza. The impact of the opioid crisis touches not only the family and friends of an addict, but the entire community. In Franklin County, the courts are seeing dozens of cases where families, especially children, are living with the negative effects of addiction. That's why the Franklin Family Drug Court was created, to help families as a parent pursues treatment. It's the first of its kind here in Massachusetts. Today on 22 News in Focus, our panel of guests are directly involved with the cases and the creation of the Family Drug Court. We have John Merrigan, Register of the Franklin Probate and Family Court, Judge Beth Crawford, First Justice of the Franklin Probate and Family Court, Betty Babinski, Chief Probation Officer for the Franklin Probate and Family Court, and Alexa Flanders, Assistant Judicial Case Manager. Thank you all so much for being here with us today. Thank you. So, Judge Crawford, I'd like to start with you. Exactly why was this court created and what does it do?
Well, when I first came to Franklin County in December of 2013, I was just so surprised by the number of opioid cases that we were seeing. We had an increasing number of families coming before the court with custody issues where a parent was struggling with opioid abuse. So as a result of that, we started thinking about what the court's response should be to that, and we put together a working group that was able to create the Franklin Family Drug Court as a result.
And how does this court differ from the traditional court system?
Well, in the traditional court system, probably the best way to describe this is to use an example. So let's say a grandmother has concerns about her grandchildren, so she may come to court seeking guardianship of her grandchildren. And what she'll do is she'll come to court and will need to prove that the parents are not fit to have custody of the children. And what may happen is she'll have temporary custody of the children while the case is processed. And what I mean by that is that it'll be determined whether or not on a long-term basis the parents will be able to have custody. We have time standards that we're required to follow in these cases, and these cases are required to go to trial within 8 months. So that doesn't give the case very much time. It's an adversarial process, and by that I mean that the grandmother has to come to court and say bad things about the parent. It may be about her own son or daughter. In this new system, the parties agree that there's a substance abuse problem, and they all agree to participate in the Family Drug Court. And what we do, rather than having the adversarial process, we have the parent who goes into treatment, which is monitored by the court and supported by the court, and the case is put on hold. The underlying custody case is put on hold. So in my example with grandma may well have temporary custody while the parents go through treatment. And our hope is, in the end, that as a result of receiving treatment, that it'll be successful and they'll be able to come back and parent. Part of the benefit of that is, of course, that it's a lot easier for families to go through a process like this rather than an adversarial process.
And just to give some perspective here, I mean, this was created because of the opiate crisis in Franklin County and all of Massachusetts. How significant is this here in our state?
The numbers have really been increasing. There's data that's available from the trial court. They've been tracking statistics of particularly overdose deaths. Unfortunately, those are the most obvious points of data to collect, but the rate of opiate death has been steadily increasing, unfortunately. And we were seeing for a while anecdotally in Franklin County. Part of my job is to assist litigants when they come in seeking an emergency order or emergency custody. And so I was seeing more and more of those emergency requests being related to substance abuse concerns about one of the parents. And now there are numbers that back that up, that we're seeing a very steady increase, particularly in Franklin County, of opiate involvement.
And this obviously has a big impact, like we said, not just on the person and maybe their family, but the entire community.
True, because what happens is when the parties come into court, it might be singling out one person who is has a substance use disorder. However, it really infiltrates the rest of the family and the community that they're part of. So our focus is hopefully that we really see some long-term productivity out of this program as well. I've been in the court for quite a while now, and I'm third generations in families. So my big wish on this is that we don't see the same parties, same families returning coming down the road, that the children whose families we're servicing now won't become part of the system and be in the same situation that unfortunately their parents and perhaps their grandparents were in.
And John, I'm going to direct this question towards you. It's a debate that's been going on here for quite some time. When we talk about the traditional court system, treatment versus incarceration for someone who's struggling from addiction, do you think that this new court system helps address that issue?
I do. I often say publicly is that 5 years ago the court system was managed in a way that it was a crime and punishment system, but under the leadership of Chief Justice Carey and our court administrator Harry Spence, they have been looking at ways to divert people away from the system. A lot of times the driver is a mental health problem, and we see a lot of opioid cases where the statistic from SAMHSA, from the federal government, is 50% of cases involving opioids involve a mental health issue. And the way heroin, the way opioids work on the brain is it just stabilizes you. It makes you so you don't care. It can be young people that have an anxiety problem, and it just takes them right to a level that nothing bothers them when they're on this drug. But it impacts all the court system, because the criminal court system, somebody gets addicted and within months they're breaking into cars and they're taking credit cards from family members or stealing grandma's jewelry, and that's a family problem, and it destroys the whole family, because everybody kind of rallies around those that are the victim in the family, and the person with the problem ends up being part of the system eventually if they don't get help. And that's what we're hoping to do with this program, is to kind of reunite the family and bring everybody back together and identify the children that have been traumatized by this. I don't think Judge Crawford mentioned it yet, but those will become the future of the court system if we don't help those young people too.
And now when we look at the addicts specifically, we talk about this program, what resources are specifically available?
Well, we call the participating parent the recovering parent. And what the recovering parent will have available, the first thing that will happen is they'll have a clinical assessment. And at that clinical assessment, the court clinician will determine what level of care they need. At a minimum, they'll have testing, regular drug testing, 7 days a week. They'll also be required to attend at least 5 self-help programs in the community. They'll have a recovery coach to support them in their recovery. There may also, in some cases, be a requirement of detox, inpatient treatment, intensive outpatient treatment, depending on the situation. They're also going to have available to them mental health treatment, individual mental health treatment.
Okay.
They'll be coming before the court regularly. We have a drug court team that will be meeting once a week to review the person's progress in treatment, and then the participants will come together as a group before the court every other week to review how things are going with them.
And now, is there a timeline on this? I mean, I don't know how long a particular case lasts, if there is a timeline, or if it's just on a case-by-case basis.
Well, I think Judge Crawford had alluded to initially when a case comes in, we're under time standards, but those time standards have been relaxed. So now we have up to 2 years to work with a family so that they really can get into treatment and get on the road to recovery. The traditional timeline would be, for the majority of cases that we're talking about, would generally be 8 months. So we know 8 months is not enough time for someone really to get a hold of their recovery and get on track and take care of themselves, and then in turn be able to take care of the rest of their family. So there's phases that are involved, and people go through the phases, and it really is determined by how they're progressing. And they may move up a couple phases, and if there's a relapse or a need for increased treatment, some form of sanction, then we'll deal with that, and that's definitely case by case and what happens. So it's not necessarily that it's 12 weeks here, 6 weeks here. As we look at the drug court model for the substance abusing parent, there are some sort of norms for those time frames, but it's not anything that we need to be adherent to and move people along in the system on a very specified time frame.
Thank you for that insight, Betty. And this family drug court doesn't just help addicts. As we mentioned, it helps their children. When we come back, we'll explore how addiction impacts a child. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Welcome back to 22 News in Focus. Today we're talking about Franklin Family Drug Court in Greenfield, the first of its kind in Massachusetts. In the last segment, we discussed why this drug court was created and how it helps addicts. The reality here is that addiction doesn't just impact the abuser, it can impact the entire family. Alexa, I'd like to start with you. I know you directly handle some of these cases. In your experience, how does a parent's addiction affect a child?
What happens frequently when a parent has substance use disorder is that the child ends up in the care, at least temporarily, of someone else, often the other parent or a grandparent or another family member. And as a court staff, we've been concerned about, what's the language that's being used to talk to that child about why they're not living with their parent anymore? And are there ways that we can help support that caregiver, make the transition easier for the child, less traumatic for the child, and also give the child some insight into the fact that it's not that the parent doesn't love them, but that the parent is struggling with his or her own illness. So we really wanted to try and minimize some of that impact because research has shown that certain adverse events like trauma, including having a parent that's using substances, being separated from a parent, those can have lifelong consequences for a child. So as Betty mentioned, we're trying to break that cycle a little bit. So we certainly recognize it may have been difficult for the child to be in a home with a parent who's using substances, and it can be very appropriate for the child not to be with the parent until the parent has achieved some level of recovery. But it's also traumatic in its own way sometimes for the child to be removed from that parent. So we're looking to help educate and refer to services for those families.
And Betty, what's the first thing that happens when a case gets taken on for the child? Is there some kind of assessment to see how traumatic the experience has been for them prior?
Each case, the child will have a trauma evaluation or an evaluation that will be trauma informed. And then there'll be a decision and recommendation as far as if treatment is necessary and what that focus of treatment should be and who the provider would be. So as part of the drug court, the caregiving, either be parent, grandparent, or whomever is taking care of the children in the absence of the parent that's in recovery or attempting to be in recovery, they will also have to file monthly with our department, with the probation department, a report as to how the child is doing. Are they attending treatment? Progress? Is school going well? It's sort of a whole checklist that they'll need to go through and report to us. And not to necessarily put one more thing on the plate for the caregiver. And that's why we kind of developed this as a checklist so that it could be going through, and they certainly can give explanation. They're also invited, the caregivers are also invited to attend the drug court sessions if it makes sense for them. So we've sort of structured it as they're welcome to attend, but they don't have to attend because particularly if it's a grandparent taking on the care of a grandchild, it might be a change in their lifestyle.
And when we talk about the child, we talked about the possibility of there being some treatment. What treatment could that consist of?
Well, we've partnered with mental health providers in the community who will be able to provide services. So that may be individual therapy for young children, that may be play therapy, it may be a lot of different sorts of things. We're going to be working with the Family Resource Center, which is part of Franklin Community Action, and they're a great referral source for both the caregiver and for the children. So they're going to be our first step in identifying the needs that the children may have. So for example, if the child has to change schools as a result of going to live with someone else, it may be that there are special education needs that the child has. There'll be supports for the caregiver through Community Action and the Family Resource Center, helping grandma figure out how to get that IEP transferred, how to get an IEP. This can be overwhelming for someone taking responsibility for these kids who have a lot of needs. So we're trying to have as many supports as possible for the children and for the caregivers.
And that can be overwhelming for the child. I mean, if you think about the possibility of having to change schools, especially at a young age, that's definitely not easy.
Well, that's one of the things we're really concerned about. We're concerned especially if the child changes schools in the middle of the school year, and we want to help the child have the words to describe what's going on. You know, when the little girl next door or sitting at the desk next to her says, "Why are you suddenly in the school? Why don't you live with your mom?" We want to help that child be able to answer that question and help the caregivers support that child in answering that question.
And John, for you, I mean, when we talk about parent privilege, I know we said this recovery process can last up to 2 years. How often can a child see a parent, and how is that determined?
Well, it's really going to be up to the court through this process, and I think, you know, as a civil court, we don't have criminal sanctions that we can offer, but you know, I think, you know, one of the incentives for a lot of families even now, you know, before the crisis struck, was they're motivated by their children. And, you know, hopefully if they don't have custody of their children, or they don't, they're not able to participate in their life, that this is a motivating factor to help them get back on track and back into the normal mainstream with their children in their lives, in their schools, and their daily activities. And you know, people really can pull through. We've seen it in many cases, and you know, this whole opioid crisis has just taken us in a different direction than we've been used to in the traditional, you know, kind of, our drug courts were built around alcohol problems, and you know, we're hoping that the incentives that we can offer to help people get better will reunite them with their children for the long term.
And Alexa, I don't know if this has come up yet in any cases, but what happens if there's a parent who needs help, but there's not another parent in the picture? There's not a grandparent in the picture. There really isn't anyone else. What happens in that situation?
Sometimes those cases would never come to us in the first place. If the Department of Children and Families feels that a child is in danger, they have the authority to take that child and place them in an appropriate placement, which for a child who has no other family members might be a foster care placement. Those cases are usually brought in the juvenile court. We can have some families who may have involvement with the Department of Children and Families, but usually, because of the nature of the things that are filed in our court, it's usually a petition for guardianship, so there's a moving party, someone seeking custody, or another complaint between parents seeking to either establish custody in the first place or change custody. So our particular system requires a party on each side, unlike if there's no one else to care for a child, not a family friend or anyone. Someone could petition for guardianship who isn't a blood relative, but in the event that there really is no one, that strikes me as probably a case that would be in juvenile court on a care and protection petition.
Okay, and now Betty, I know that you talked and mentioned about caregivers and how there is resources available for them as well. Can you kind of talk to me about when you are the caregiver? Obviously, you know, maybe it's your loved one, a spouse, someone who's in recovery, and now the burden has really shifted on you. What is available for them?
I think one of the first things that we're hoping to do is make sure that we do some education for the parties, because talking about the medical model of addiction, so that whomever is now going to be, let's say, the new caregiver, presuming that it's someone new stepping into that role, that they're aware of sort of what addiction is all about, and what controls people do have and don't have. So rather than blaming someone and getting into the name calling to create that adversarial role between them, that they would have some more understanding. And then, so I think the educational piece we see as key in the beginning. And Dr. Ruth Potee, who's on our advisory board, has done a fabulous video, which is one of the first things that we're going to require that the caregiver, that they have an opportunity to watch that, so that they can start to have a better understanding. And whatever other supports that they need. So if you're a parent who is now, maybe hadn't been the caregiver, and now in the role of being a caregiver, do you have health insurance for the child? Are you aware of what's happening at school for them? So all of those, you know, really sort of daily supports that ultimately the child is going to need, that if a person is not aware of how to get those services or where to begin and what to look for services, those are the supportive things that we're going to work with the caregiver, so that they can begin to sort of normalize life for themselves and the child or children.
Okay, and just before we head to our next break, I just want to ask you one quick question, Judge. When it comes to cases, do both people need to be on board with this? Does the addict need to say, I want to take part?
They do. They both need to. So in my example of the grandmother would need to agree and the parents would need to agree. If this is between, let's say, custody been with a mom and dad is coming in because mom has a substance use disorder, both mom would need to agree to go into treatment and to be part of the drug court, and dad would need to agree to do that as well.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. Now, this court does do great work within the community, but it does come at a cost. Coming up, we'll explain how this court was created and who's funding it. You're watching 22 News in Focus. You're watching 22 News in Focus. I'm Juliana Mazza, here with an expert panel to talk about this new family drug court in Franklin County. We've addressed how it works and the benefits for addicts and their families. But now it's time to figure out who's paying for it. Let's start with the basic costs. John, can you kind of describe to me, who's funding this?
There is not a whole lot of outside funding involved. We have some funding from DMH, the Department of Mental Health, on the clinical piece. We're working with our local agencies, as Judge Crawford mentioned. Franklin Community Action has a host of programs that help young people. They have state and federal funding already in place to assist. And then there's a number of providers that just a few years ago in Franklin County did not exist, because we really kind of hit this crisis out of nowhere. You know, if I tell people 5 years ago, we did not have a heroin problem in Franklin County. So we've been able to we've created the opioid task force back in 2014. We've been able to pull together a tremendous amount of resources with the support of our legislators, both the administration, Deval Patrick, and the current governor, Governor Baker, have focused on resources for this problem. And in fact, we will be opening a 64-bed detox facility in Greenfield in July. And we had a facility that closed in 2003 because of budget cuts. So we're building up, and we're trying to put the resources in place, and I think in many cases they will help us with this family court program.
And when we look ahead to the budget for fiscal 2017, I mean, we're looking at a gap there. Is there any concern that maybe that will fall back and impact this court in some way?
Yeah, I mean, as we talk, the legislators and the governor are looking at a $750 million shortfall, but you know, you have to think about where we have been in terms of the Commonwealth, in terms of the country post 9/11, these problems with you know, the opioid crisis. You know, we need to talk about a revenue stream at some point to address the problems in the Commonwealth. You know, it's popular to say no new taxes, and that's what we hear all the time, but you know, it's probably been 5 or 6 years since we have done a revenue package in the Commonwealth, and we can't continue to squeak by. If we cut $750 million out of this budget year, I can guarantee you programs like this that help us in this epidemic will be impacted. And I don't care how you slice it, it will cut into what we're trying to do. I know the legislature and the governor are doing the best they can, but they really need to find a stream of revenue to deal with the problems that this Commonwealth is dealing with, or we're going to continue to go downhill.
And Judge, when we look at some of the programs that are available, rehab, detox, who's paying for that? I mean, that obviously does not fall on the person who's getting the treatment.
Right, that's being provided by different community programs, and insurance may cover some of those programs as well. Within the court itself, the only additional cost that we've had for ourselves is we have a court clinician who we didn't have before. So we now have a court clinician part-time, 20 hours per week to assist us. We also have one additional, the Commissioner of Probation gave us an additional half-time probation officer to help us with this as well. So from the trial court's perspective, this has not been a lot of cost, but we are relying a lot on community programs and their sources of funding. We're very lucky that the Family Resource Center through Community Action is available to parties free of cost regardless of income. So a lot of we're depending upon them a lot to provide services to our population.
And Alexa, with some of the cases that you've seen when you're trying to find people the right programs and looking into this, how important is it to make sure that we're developing such strong relationships with different community outreach programs to make sure that these resources are still available?
It's absolutely vital, because as a court, if we don't have agencies that we can refer people to who can really help them, then there's not a whole lot of hope for lasting change for families. And so our hope is that in the long term, if we have strong partnerships in the community and we're able to help people address the underlying problems that bring them to court, that it will save money over time. Because now, if we don't address and help change some of those behavior patterns and some of those problems, we see some of the same families coming back again and again and again. So because right now we have this wonderful network of programs in the community, we're very hopeful, we're optimistic that we'll be able to help really address some of those issues and not have people come back to court as often.
Okay, and now,
do.
Betty, when it comes to cases, can you kind of explain to me exactly how a case is filed? Obviously, if someone wants some of these resources, does it make it easier for them to gain access if they come and file a case through the court system?
Well, first of all, they do have to have a pending case in our court. We've been getting some referrals, having people call in from some different agencies, but if they don't have a case in our court, we can't offer them services such as the Family Drug Court. So the first sort of the baseline is that they need to have a pending matter in the Franklin Probate and Family Court. So once that petition or complaint is filed, they come in, and generally people come in and will file a motion requesting some temporary orders because there's an immediate situation that needs to be addressed. So once that is filed, the first place that they land generally is in the probation department, and we meet with the people and talk about what are the issues, and that's where a lot of the information comes out as we sit at a table. It's a quasi-mediation session, different than that, but and that would be, we might say, you know, this seems to be appropriate for the Family Drug Court, and we would then explain the drug court. The clinician who's been spoken about, she's there on our busy motion day, which is Thursdays, and will be available to do some immediate evaluations and see if people are in fact eligible for the drug court. So we're hoping that it's can be a somewhat immediate response to a situation, because it could potentially be a crisis situation as well, where people come in on an emergency. And then the process will begin, the evaluation, the appropriateness, and once the clinician does the evaluation and it's deemed that they should be part of the drug court, she really is going to help drive what services from her clinical background, and you know what sort of supports the family will need, focusing on the substance abusing parent at that point.
You mentioned a key word, eligibility. So, Judge, can you kind of explain who is eligible? I know some people have been wondering if this addict has maybe criminal charges filed against them, can they still come to the Family Drug Court and get help?
Sure. If they have a case pending in our court, then they will have the potential to qualify if they have a substance use disorder. So that's what's going to be key when the clinician evaluates them, is to determine whether or not they have a substance use disorder that affects their ability to parent. The case may come in all different ways. It may come in, we had a case recently that came in actually on a child support issue. That's how the case got before the court, but it became clear that the underlying issue was really a parenting issue, and that there was a substance use disorder in that case. So someone who has a criminal charge, which is not handled in our court, that would be handled in the district or the superior court, may also have a family case involved in our court, and they could participate in our drug court.
Are there cases that you're seeing that are just more prevalent? Anything specific like that? Any trends?
We see an awful lot of grandparents coming to our court. That was, I think, is probably what strikes us the most. We see an awful lot of fathers who have not been custodial parents also coming, seeking custody of the children because of the mother's substance use disorder.
And have the addicts at this point, have they been really receptive? I'm sure admitting that you have a problem and trying to seek help is not always easy.
It's a hard piece. It's a very hard piece of it. And especially in the adversarial model, the person coming seeking custody has the burden of proving it. And that's done in a court hearing where you have to say, you know, not so nice things about the other party. So we're hoping through this process, knowing that the parent doesn't have to go through that part of it, that they will be receptive to trying treatment knowing that they don't have to go through that initial adversarial piece. It may also be, though, that the case comes in that way and that we go through the adversarial piece and at the beginning and someone else is given temporary custody, and at that point the parent elects to be part of the family drug court.
Okay. Now, it seems like regardless of how often that we talk about addiction, there is still this stigma that surrounds it. After the break, we'll talk about how this new court aims to break misconceptions and stereotypes. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Welcome back to 22 News in Focus. Today, you're learning about the new innovative drug court model, the Franklin Family Drug Court. One of the court's goals is to address the stigma that surrounds addiction. So what are some of the major misconceptions that are out there right now?
Well, I think part of it is that it's a choice, and every time someone picks up and uses, that they're using their cognitive skills and making the decision to do that. And I think, as we've learned over time with this medical model, that there's a variety of ways that people became drug involved, and it could have been through prescription, it could have been with a friend, but I think as you learn more about it and you get into the whole science model of it, you start to realize that people who are in the throes of addiction don't have the capabilities to handle it on their own, and it is no longer a choice. It is a need, it's a want, it's a strong desire. And it's really not an option whether they use or not. They need to use.
And do you think that at some point this stigma that surrounds addiction, can this impact someone's ability to say, you know what, I do need help?
I definitely think so. If people think they're going to be judged morally by admitting that they have a problem, they may be reluctant to do that. So I think it's very important that the message keeps getting out there. It's starting. We've learned a lot as we've been involved in this process of building this court about the science behind it and really what's happening. And I think as that message gets out more and more, it may help people feel more comfortable, not be ashamed. They have a lot of company, unfortunately, of people who are struggling with addiction.
And how does this court try to help break some of the stereotypes and the stigma? Obviously, the work that you guys do specifically with the addicts really helps them specifically kind of realize that this is something that requires real help.
That piece, and then also providing information to the other family members. So to the caregiver who's caring for the child, as Betty talked about, we want all of them to watch Dr. Potte's video about the brain science of addiction, because we think that that will help them understand that it may not be a choice, and about the changes that happen in the parent's brain and how long it takes in order for those changes in the brain to go away. We want to make sure that people understand that this is not a moral issue, especially the children, because this is a very hard situation for the children who are suddenly finding themselves in a new home, and as we talked about, being asked questions in school about why they may be in a new school, why they're in a new home. We don't want them to be ashamed of this. We want them to have the language to be able to talk about it, and part of that will come from their caregivers being supportive of them and helping them understand what's happening with their parents.
And now sometimes children might have a hard time talking about this, especially if they're at such a young age. Is there anything that parents, other caregivers, teachers, maybe school resource officers can do to kind of look and see maybe there's something here?
Well, that's one of the things the task force has been doing is getting into the school system, trying to educate, guidance counselors or teachers about programs that might be available, but also, I think, as we talk about kind of intercepting people at an early age, it could be, the signs could be anxiety, could be some, child that's quiet in the corner and doesn't engage. And as I talked about earlier, this whole, when they get older, and sometimes we're hearing in the court system, 14 and 15-year-olds are using, and there's an underlying issue usually attached to that. So, we're trying to connect the courts, and it's unprecedented that the courts are trying to connect with services in the community, like we're doing, trying to connect with the schools, and as I said before, you know, we are a system of crime and punishment, and the fact that we are kind of bonding with resources in the community to help not just the child, but the parents and the grandparents is really historic for the court to be looking at that.
And Judge, when we look at school systems, is there any law, anything like that in our state that requires teachers undergo some kind of training to understand signs of children who might be struggling with some kind of internal issue?
You know, there's no law that requires it, except I can tell you that we are becoming more trauma informed in Massachusetts. And a lot of teachers, certainly in the courts, social workers are being trained to look for signs of trauma in children and to anticipate that and to create environments that don't trigger trauma in children. So that certainly seems to be the way things are heading these days.
And just along those lines, you know, one of the things we did last year with Dr. Poti, as we talked about her involvement with the task force, is that we, that with Greenfield Community College hosting us, we trained 80 school nurses with her. She has a, not only that science of addiction that she does, but she kind of customized a program that was directed at school nurses that it was an amazing amount. We thought we were only going to see Franklin County nurses, but we had nurses from all over the state that ended up turning out. And I think since then, DSAS, the department, through the Department of Public Health, has offered these school nurse training opportunities throughout the rest of the state. So, you know, it's not mandatory, but I think people understand enough where they're stepping up and volunteering to get trained.
So we're moving in the right direction,
Right.
definitely.
Yeah. Yep.
And now we talk a lot about the community resources that this court relies on to make sure that people are getting the help they need. How has the community been receiving this? Are they very receptive?
Incredibly so. And I think the opioid task force, with the inception of that, I think our first meeting was how many people, John?
15 people.
15 people, and it has exploded in that we need to use the huge room at GCC when there's meetings now. And it's been all kinds of partnerships and stakeholders through the schools, the hospital, all of the different social service agencies, the jail. It's pretty amazing the partnerships that have been formed and the work that has come out of the task force, which really has put wind under our wings to be able to move this forward, because the groundwork has been laid, and the task force has been in existence 3 years now.
Just going on 3 years.
So, and it's a pretty incredible force, and it really was a community-based outcry that people came and they recognized the problems that were in the community. I don't know how many people have gotten up and spoken at different venues that we've had to say, I've lost a child through a heroin overdose, or I'm in recovery myself. So it's very across the board as far as the people that are participating in this, and like I said, the partnerships are pretty amazing. And people finding out what other agencies and programs do and building bridges with each other rather than living in silos.
Helps raise awareness for sure.
Yeah.
Well, the Family Drug Court is a model project, so what is the future for this type of court here in Massachusetts? We'll have that discussion when we return. You're watching 22 News in Focus. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Today we've been talking about the creation of the Franklin Family Drug Court. And now we'd like to look to its future. So when an addict goes through these programs, how do you know when they're ready to return and transition back into everyday society?
Well, although we're a new court, we're able to use some of the research that's been done. Drug courts have been in existence for quite a while now, so we're using a phase structure which is currently in use in our district court drug courts. And so as someone progresses through treatment, they basically move from one phase to the other, so there's less court oversight of them. They're still being tested, they're still coming to court. They're expected to do more and more as they progress through the phases in terms of maybe looking for a job, making sure they have stable housing, really reintegrating into the community. So by the time they're at that last phase, which is phase 5, they're expected to be no longer using substances, a productive member of society, and capable of having very little court oversight. So at least from what we see from other courts that have been doing this, it seems pretty clear when someone's able to maintain their sobriety, meet their obligations, and they're at that level that they're ready to go.
And obviously transitioning back into everyday life is certainly not easy after you've been struggling with this for some time.
I think that's true. We're hoping to keep people involved, so we don't want to necessarily have people feel like they entirely lose those supports when they're done. So we'd like to have people perhaps participate as peer mentors. I think there's a lot of research that shows that support from other people going through what you're going through is really effective. And we do have we're hoping to have some incentives, so we have a couple of helpful things to make the transition a little smoother. For parents who owe child support, perhaps back child support, we've had a very wonderful partnership from the Department of Revenue, that is the agency that collects child support and enforces those orders. And they've agreed not to use some of the remedies at their disposal, like suspending driver's licenses and levying bank accounts while a parent is going through this process. So helping ease some of those collateral issues may make that transition a little easier to help someone get back on their feet. And we're possibly there may be a possibility of some ability to get into the Greenfield Community College a little more easily for our participants as well.
Okay, and Judge, just questions for you. When we talk about when is it time, or if it will ever be time, for a child to reunite with their parent?
Sure. Well, that is likely to happen gradually. So, for instance, many times when a parent will first come into the family drug court, they'll have supervised contact with the child, because we want to be sure that they're not using substances when they're around the child, or in any way having any negative influence or impact on the child. So it may start out as supervised visits. It may start out at a supervised visitation center in the community, may then turn to unsupervised visits as the parent progresses through the different phases. So as the parent starts doing better, there'll be more and more contact with the child. The court always has to pay attention to what's in the child's best interest. And hopefully in many cases we'll have a child who's in therapy, and we may have input from that child's therapist. We're also going to hear from the child's custodian about how it's going. If a parent is going through a supervised visitation center, we get a report about how those visits are going. So we have a whole lot of information that we use to make that determination as to what the contact between the parent and the child should be.
Now, I know this court is obviously fairly new. I think it was a couple weeks now. But I guess my question is, what happens if an addict relapses? Is this court a one-shot deal for them?
It's not a one-shot deal, and in fact, we assume at the beginning there may well be relapse, and that we have to take that into account. That doesn't mean there may not be sanctions, but we certainly don't want them to not participate if they're still willing to participate. And it may be that they're just not ready for the level where they are. So, for example, if they've moved to another phase, they may not be ready for that. We may need to go back and relook at what their treatment needs are. So that's where our clinician comes in to help us determine what their needs for treatment are at that point, given the relapse.
And is there anything in place to study how effective this court will be here in our area?
We are doing an evaluation. We wish we had a big university who wanted to come in and study what we're doing, but we are certainly going to collect data. We're going to collect data about the drug testing results. We're going to collect data about who is doing what within the community, how many self-help groups, those sorts of things. So we're going to have a lot of data out there available for us. We will also know how many parents have graduated from drug court by completing all the phases. So we'll be able to keep track of that as well.
And John, looking forward, this model here that we have, is there a hope or a goal of maybe instituting this model in other regions?
Yeah, so we're very engaged with the trial court leadership on this project. As I mentioned, Chief Justice Carey has been supporting programs like this, specialty courts we call them. There's a veterans court that just opened in Holyoke. There's the drug courts that have been in existence. This is the first of its kind. But in fact, yesterday in Boston, I had a meeting with my colleagues from the other 13 counties, and we talked in detail about this program. and we're hoping to launch this in other courts. It takes a lot of work from the staff. It takes a judge that really has the passion like Judge Crawford does, because they've spent a year and a half putting this proposal together with Betty and with Jody Nolan, who works with us, and with Alexa, and they had to be approved. We had to be approved by the trial court to do this. So hopefully we've created a roadmap for other courts in the Commonwealth. We will travel to those courts. We will show them how we did it. And Judge Crawford is close with many of her colleagues who have already shown an interest in the eastern part of the state and some courts out here in the west as well.
Okay. And Betty, when it comes to getting a case started, if someone's watching this and is thinking this might be a program that's good for me or someone that I know, can they place a phone call? What's the best way for someone to try and learn more about this?
Well, certainly they're welcome to call our court and be in touch with us. We're going to give you some information that you can disperse so people know who to be in touch with and how to get the ball rolling. Currently it is only in Franklin County. We do hope that we have great success and that it moves all over the Commonwealth and beyond. But there's certainly we'd love to talk to anybody that's interested in pursuing this, and especially if it's someone that's looking towards taking steps towards their own recovery.
Okay. And John, I didn't forget, there was one thing that you mentioned that we have some time I want to talk about.
Sure.
You mentioned there's a new detox facility that could be coming and more beds will be available. And just from being out in the community, so many people have told us, I know someone who needs help and they can't get treatment. Yeah,
so in 2003, Franklin County had a very active detox program, and again, it was really based around the alcohol issues involving probably criminal matters, domestic violence matters, and that went away 13 years ago. Fortunately, this administration and the previous administration committed to funding a 64-bed detox facility that is planning to open in July. 32 beds of stabilization, 32 beds of detox. The stabilization piece is after somebody gets sober and after 7 or 10 days. And then the stabilization piece allows them to look at options to go back into the community, hopefully not to their former housing where their neighbor's their dealer and they're right back at it. So it's a great resource. We're troubled too because we can't find beds, and when you do find a bed, it's in the eastern part of the state, and that presents a problem too because they don't want to leave the area for help.
So this is definitely something that you said July that we can look out for.
We're hoping for July. There's been some delays. It was supposed to open earlier in the year, and in fact, Dr. Pote is the medical director of this detox, and she's been pushing hard to make sure they open. It's through BHN, which is based out of Hampden County. Behavioral Health Network, and they've come up and offered this resource in their service, and they've become a huge partner with us in our effort to fight this battle in Franklin County throughout, whether it's with the courts or the task force, but in general.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for explaining all the resources that are available. We'll get that information on wwlp.com. We'll have the last word for you after the break. Stay with us. You're watching 22 News in Focus. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Today we've been discussing the newest specialty court, the Franklin Family Drug Court, the first of its kind in Massachusetts. Now the state is hoping that families and caregivers from across Franklin County, especially children that are affected by substance abuse, will face a brighter future by providing treatments and services that will help them recover both physically and emotionally. That's our program for today. We want to thank you, our guests, for joining us today, and thank you, the viewer, for watching. If you missed any of this, you can watch it in full on our website, wwlp.com. From all of us here at 22 News, have a wonderful Sunday.